I don't really know what I'm going to talk about. I'm a little baked. Plan to get more. And I'm just going to sit here and talk. The title of this is Maybe Next Week It'll Be Swords. And that is a line from Red Dawn. It's one of my favorite movies. I think Red Dawn has many things that could apply to our current situation. Really, there's many of the works of John Milius that apply to our situation right now. He was a conspiracy theorist and believed World War III was coming and all sorts of other shit. And I think he was right. You know, this shit going down in Taiwan right now is insane. You guys recall, I said that China was going to invade Taiwan in like September, October of this year. We're on track for that. And because of that shit, I'm focusing on projects and shit. And like, that's why the swords, like, I'm focusing on filling out my entire like armory basically, because like gun wise I have what I want to have. I've thinned the herd a little bit from my collection video. I sold my Canic and my FAL, and the Canic was just the least favorite of the handguns, and the FAL, I didn't have any ammo for it. I was short on mags, and it was a gun that would be easy to sell for a whole bunch of money. So I took the two of those and went and sold those, and I'm using that money to fund other shit right now. And I did, as a consolation prize for selling my FAL, I bought a sword. Let's talk about that. When it comes to buying a sword, I don't think that you should just go and buy a sword that I tell you to buy. I had someone ask what sword they should buy for Shit Hits the Fan. Maybe that's the topic of this video. The swords that I chose for Shit Hits the Fan are, well, I haven't bought the last one yet, the last couple. I want a kukri and a dirk, and those are mostly for collectible purposes, but also because a kukri is a useful tool. I'm going to get a Kukuri House Jungle Training kukri. It's like $70 shipped from Nepal. And the dirk I want is from Todd's stuff, Todd's workshop, whatever. He makes a $150, 150 pound, something like that, Scottish dirk. I want that thing. Now, what I have bought already in terms of swords, you guys have seen the Cold Steel Gladius machete. I really think if you just need a cheap sword, that thing's pretty bitchin'. It is a machete, not a sword, but like with modern steels, there's not much of a difference. That thing would have passed as a fucking Gladius in ancient Rome. 100%. It would have been like the coolest, best one ever. That's like the Excalibur of Gladiuses. And for my other sword, I picked the Cold Steel Shamshir. Shamshir. If I could, it's a scimitar. I hate saying the Persian name of this sword. It's horrible. Scimitar is the Arabic name of this sword, and it is many things. It is a cavalry saber. It is a pirate sword. It is, you know, a sword of the Middle East and Africa. Like I like this sword for me because it speaks to me, and I like things about it. And it's one-handed, and I'm kind of a fencer, and I like one-handed swords. I don't like katanas. I think katanas are really short and two-handed, and I just don't like them. Basically, I think a wakizashi. If you're gonna, if you want a modern sword, using a wakizashi one-handed is probably pretty good. I like that sword. I just don't like the katana compared to other full-size swords. It is a very small full-size sword. That's why I didn't pick it. Uh, Also, I tend to like curved blades because they cut better, and you want something that you can still stab with, which this thing you can. So this is a cut and thrust sword. If I was going to buy one sword instead of having a couple of different swords, I think I would look for something like this in a cutlass. A cutlass would be like a foot shorter than this scimitar, but kind of a 18th century, 17th century navy sword. Something like that in a modern context would be good for close quarters. I wanted a full-size sword for fighting other people with swords. And you might be like, when are you ever going to do that? Well, I'm hoping whenever the world ends, there's other crazy people with swords, and they want to have a fucking duel or some shit. Like, if not, we're all just going to be shooting each other, and that's boring as fuck. So, as a result of this and the fear of lack of ammunition, I have a couple of shields now, a couple of swords now, a couple of spears, a whole bunch of knives, hammers, bats. I got a cat. He just like walked up and rammed his head into my head. Anyway, I have a sickle thing. That's like Kurosawa Gamma. Guess it's just a Kurosawa. It's a fucking like Japanese style like grass sickle, rice sickle thing. I got it for like $8 on Amazon from Echo, the chainsaw company. I sharpened the tip of it and wrapped it in some 100-mile-an-hour tape and some grip tape and shit, and put a stripe of paint on it, and it's pretty badass. I don't think it would survive being used in combat. I think it would be a 2 to 3 opponent weapon before it broke. But it's still cool. Like, it would definitely kill at least one person before it broke. That's after wrapping it in 100-mile-an-hour tape. Before that, I don't know that it would have. You should probably spend more than $8 on one of those. But I don't figure on ever using it. It's mostly just to cut grass with. It's in my garden tools as like the emergency last ditch weapon. I'm ridiculous. I know I'm ridiculous. I'm a trans woman who collects weapons and swords and shit. The men I date think that those two things are connected. The fact that I like dick and swords, they somehow think those things are very connected. And the fact that my knife company's logo said cock, I guess they might be right. I don't know what it is. I like long pointy things. I'd like to get another cold steel sword at some point. Like, that's the thing now, is I bit the bullet and bought one of their fucking swords. And I'm not saying every cold steel sword is good to go. I think you are very much rolling the dice on some of their products. And this thing, to some people, would not be acceptable. To be very clear, this thing has a bunch of flaws in it. But they are the kind of flaws that one of these swords in the 1800s would have had, and I like that. This was made in India by Windlass, I'm pretty sure, and it's a nice windlass. But Windlass makes their shit in the same way they did in the 1800s. And as a result, like, this sword has some like waves and hammer marks in it that have just been polished. That's the way these swords were historically. I don't see a problem with that. I kind of like it, to be honest. It makes this thing look legit. Because, to be honest, Saudi Arabia and shit like that, they weren't ever making swords. And I'm not saying they weren't ever, but like, it wasn't their thing. these swords that they had were being made in India and Iran and Pakistan, places like that. There's big traditions in those regions of sword making, and that's why Cold Steel goes to Windlass to get this, because Windlass is a new company formed out of the families of these people that have been doing this forever and ever and ever. I like Indian bladesmiths quite a bit. I would love to go to India and hang out there for a while, especially Nepal, just north of India. I would love to go to where they make the kukris. Like if I had unlimited funds, I would definitely be in India or Nepal right now. Except for the fact that China is an asshole. I'm pretty sure that no, it's Tibet they have. They don't have Nepal. I wouldn't want to go to any foreign countries right now with some of the shit that I have on my head. For those not in the know, I'm wanted in Iran, Cuba, North Korea, China, somewhere else. Not Russia, strangely enough. Putin takes me, apparently. I don't know what's up with that. But, like, all of the rest of the enemy hit parade, if I ever set foot in any of those countries, I'm going to not see the outside of a dark hole for a long time. So, as a result, us going to war with China, I guess I got skin in the game, is what I'm saying. As it turns out, when your policy towards enemies of the United States is fuck them and let's be pirates, you get warrants. And the funny part is, most of that shit is for just talking. I have a big mouth, apparently. Cuba, not so much. All the shit in China, all I ever did was talk shit about them on the internet. That's what really pisses me off. Fucking funny. Get a fucking warrant for your arrest in China because you talk shit about them on Instagram. That's glorious. I have said death to China a bunch. Like, and that's literally how I feel about them. And I'm glad that they feel that way about me as well. Should be mutual. Back to swords. If I was going to get another sword at this point, I'm thinking about getting a cheap Crusader sword that is actually made of real steel and whatever, but it's not finished very well and has some things about it that I'm probably going to need to adjust. I want to get one of those and just completely redo it for a series of videos and then give it to my buddy. And the reason that I want to give it to him is because I already have swords and whatever, and like I want to do this for the video of it and whatnot. And I want to take $100 sword and see how good of a sword I can make out of it. And depending on how it balances and feels, I might even like take a grinder to the bitch. Like, I doubt that they make a sword that feels that bad in hand, but you never know. That's the thing about this cold steels. I actually like the way this thing feels in hand. It's a little front heavy, but it's a saber, so it's like supposed to be. And really, if I do it, the grip with a finger in front of the guard, which is not how you would hold this sword traditionally, but it is how I would hold swords of other eras that are very similar to this. If you do that, it balances amazing, in my opinion. Holding it back at the end, the balance is a little off. I've been thinking about adding a block of copper on the back end of this thing just to fucking offset. Maybe that would fix it. Or I could just use it with my finger in front of the guard. There's a lot of swords that are meant to be used that way. If you ever see a sword with a complex hilt, they usually include rings over the guard that are made for you to put your finger through. So, like, that is a legitimate way to fence or fight with a sword or whatever it is you're going to do. I still think it's funny that when I suggested to my girlfriend that we get, foils or whatever and learn fencing or whatever because we were watching it on the Olympics, she looked at me and said that she wasn't that gay. I have pictures that prove that she's that gay, but that's topic for another day. I miss that girl. That was like the best thing she ever said, though. Like, that was one of those, like, wow, I'm starting to rub off on you. Uh, I think sword fighting is worth knowing, especially like if you consider if you don't have guns, what has historically been the weapon of choice and why? The sword and the spear. And the reason the sword is the go-to defensive weapon is because it's easier to carry than a spear. That's, obvious. Like, in reality, a a sword like this scimitar or a cavalry saber or marine officer's sword or anything in this like 1800s ish sword, like I the scimitar really isn't a part of that, but like it heavily influenced all of those swords. In reality, I think, this sword that I'm holding basically originated when Genghis Khan first saw tulwars. Because this thing is like a tulwar with a better hilt, in my opinion. I don't like the Indian tulwar that much. I get why they like it, and that's cool for them. I just don't think it's very stylish. It's an all business hilt, and I'm a little flashier than that. And like these swords that we call scimitars or whatever were being used in Persia and the Mongol Empire, and basically identical swords being used in India with different hilts. Okay, the West started using similar swords to everybody else. I don't know what's up with that. I think it's just everybody else was already pretty much fighting on horseback all the time. And once you're doing that, like this sword makes sense. And it became a thing to where swords on foot really weren't a thing in Europe anymore so much unless you were a marine officer directing fire on the deck of a ship or something like that, which is why that sword remains. But the other swords that remained were cavalry sabers, and a cavalry saber, a scimitar, and a tulwar are very, very similar swords in my opinion. Like at least the blades of them. The tulwar is probably the least similar of those. That's because the ones I've seen are usually not as sturdy as a saber, but like maybe that's just because the ones I saw were old. I'd be very curious to handle one next to this now. I've been watching a lot of Talwar training videos from a guru in India because it directly applies to this sword, and it's very interesting to see how that's like it looks like he's 50, 60-year-old man fights with a sword who's been fighting with a sword his whole life. Um, Apparently, in India, Sikhs can still carry swords in day-to-day life because they never gave them up to the British. That's kind of badass. Like, this is the shit that, like, eventually I'm gonna take a trip to India. There's there's too much shit there that I want to go see. And like there's a lot of places where I wouldn't feel safe to go. I would 100% go to India without fear. The Middle East apparently probably is not a good place for me. Unless I want to wear a burqa, then maybe I could get away with it. I'd have to have a male escort. If anyone wants to be my male escort for trips to the Middle East, holler. That would be fucking fun, really. You know, until you got stoned and raped to death by a crowd of Muslim men cheering the great Satan or some shit. All I said was that you looked kind of gay. Like, that's how my adventures in the Middle East would go nowadays. We would definitely get stoned. I don't know, maybe there's a progressive place in the Middle East. Is Dubai progressive? I doubt it. Although it has Steven Seagal there, so still cracks me up. As far as other swords go, back to that conversation. A Cavalry Saber would be a good choice. It has U.S. history to it. It's fairly cheap. It's a good sword. You can find something like that that's battle ready for under $200 for sure. It'll have a good scabbard with it. It'll have a steel scabbard, which will be noisy. You need to know that. Like, that's half of the thing that I like about the leather scabbard that I got with this scimitar is it's a pretty good thing for what I want it for. I can put a rope on it, and it's like a sling for a rifle. I just, tote it with me. If I go to sit down somewhere, I take the sword off and set it, next to the table or fucking in the car or wherever it is. Like, in a modern context, you're going to need to be able to take the sword on and off. Between buildings and cars, there's just too many things where you're going to have the sword on and off. I thought about having it belt mounted because that would be dope. At this point, I'm kind of figuring on having like sword and pistol and maybe a small rifle of some sort. Like, that's what it's going to be in my minivan of doom or whatever. Unless the world fully ends. If it goes totally Mad Max, then I guess, all bets are off. I'm going to arm it to the teeth or whatever. I want to go adventuring in the U.S. and I'm probably going to go with limited arms just because of the risk of shit getting stolen. I'm trying to decide right now what's going to come and what's not. And at this point, the sword is definitely coming. It's cheap. It will scare the homeless people off. And I kind of figure like this thing and a 9mm handgun. I would say the black powder revolver, but that would be awesome. I don't know. I'm kind of thinking the car and sword. Maybe a sword and shield. Like, that's really the combo in the modern context I think is going to be huge that no one's talking about. A shield doesn't provide a lot of advantages against bullets. It provides a whole shit ton of advantages against the peasantry armed with whatever they have in their hands. My favorite purchase is a cold steel buckler. It's $20. Thing's badass. What about a European sword, like a medieval sword? Why didn't I get one of those? Well, you very easily could. Um, if I was going to get one of those, I would get a medieval arming sword, which is a one-handed, lighter weight belt sword. It's a sidearm. It's much in the same way as that cavalry saber or this scimitar. It's made to be worn. And like that's the thing is you don't buy like a claymore and anticipate carrying that every day. The sword that I have here weighs like a pound and a half. It's pretty light. Like the cold steel gladius machete is even lighter. And like the likelihood that I pack that thing is high because it is a sword that does other shit for me. Whereas like the scimitars, really kind of it's a toy. It's a toy and a hope that someone else brings their toy and that we get to have our sword duel in the middle of World War III. That's what this is. And like, if I can take the weight, I'm going to pack it. If I can't, the Gladius machete might come. If I can't take that, well, then I have a knife. Like, I'm going to have a bladed weapon of some sort. And it's all dependent, really, on how much weight you can pack. And I'm going to do a video on my options right now. I want to get a kukri. I might wait for that before I do that video. But for you and your options, like, who are you? What do you like in a sword? So, like, half of the reason that I picked this sword is because it's a pirate sword, and it was a big sword in Texas, Oklahoma in the 1800s. People carried these as status symbols because they went overseas and got one and came back. Okay, and it was like a cavalry saber. So, like, this is a very particular fashion statement of a sword that I happen to like. So, like, if you are Japanese in ancestry, maybe you do want a katana despite its, shortcomings. If that's you, I would highly suggest a wakizashi. That is there's 3 sizes, well, 4 sizes really of those blades, and this is how I have the nomenclature worked out. It's slightly different than this. At the bottom, there's the tanto. That's like a knife. Above that's a wakizashi. It's like short sword. If I could talk. Next is the katana, and then above that is like the O katana, which is a longer battlefield katana that really didn't exist much back in the day. Like it's debatable whether it existed in like medieval Japan, but in 1700s Japan or whatever, the samurai period and all that shit, it was not a real thing. It very likely was a thing when they were actually fighting more. Anyway, the reason that I would pick the wakizashi out of those is it can be used with one hand, like I said earlier. It's the right length. It is still a sword, but it is short enough that you could use it in CQB. Now, what if you're like, oh man, I want a fucking ancient sword. Ancient. I want like one of the first swords. Well, I would discourage you from going copper or bronze. So let's talk about steel. And everything in that realm is a gladius or some version of it, really. There's a few Greek swords, Copus, shit like that. I wouldn't bother with those. So again, I have the Gladius machete because it's $20 or whatever. But like, if you're wanting a real Gladius, um, I would go windless probably. I would see what Cold Steel offers, but that's the realm I would look at. Like, I would go to Cult of Athena and look at their Gladiuses and go to Battle Ready and see what pops up. It's like, shop for what you like. It's you're going to spend several $100s on this, and it's as big of a purchase as a gun in some ways. And it's cool. It's something that you are going to enjoy, especially if you do a little bit of thought before you buy it. And it seems like, there's no reason to spend money on a sword right now. I beg to differ. Basically, in the world that we're going into, it's looking increasingly like the Democrats are going to outlaw all firearms. A lot of what I do with melee weapons here is preparing myself now for whenever they outlaw all the guns. Because as much as we all are like, oh, we're going to have a revolution, no one else ever fucking does that. So I just kind of assume that that's going to continue to be the way. And that then I'm going to be in my fucking minivan touring the country or whatever with a black powder revolver and a sword. And if that's what I have, that's what I have. It's the nature of being, mobile like that without your own land is I'm going to have to be legal. So I'm hoping to have a home base where I can, dig a big tunnel system like Rambo and bury all my guns. That movie was so dope. Like, the rest of the movie sucked. I didn't care shit about that, but like his setup at the beginning where they're showing off his tunnel system and whatever, like that was very fucking cool. I just want to have that now. It'd be cool to have like a romantic cabin in the woods, like a bedroom with a kitchenette kind of a thing that like had a closet that you opened up and it was a staircase or something down to the rest of the house. So like on one level it looks like a romantic little cottage in the woods for you and your significant other, and on another level it's like a castle with defenses and fucking you know moats and shit and whatever, and like in reality it's like a fucking cabin with a creek with this giant bunker built into it. I know I'm weird. I've been told I am a weird chick, and the cool part is you get all of this, and I bake cookies and do other things. Like I don't talk a lot about the girl shit on this channel. Like I talk a lot about the stuff that I figure people want to hear about, and swords because I'm going to talk about that regardless. I don't think I'm that weird of a chick. I think I'm just free to be me. Most women aren't. That's what I think. The whole trans thing is getting crazy. And not, I don't mean like my transition. I mean like in the world, like there is this like tug of war going on between two sides of crazy people that I'm not a part of either of them, but yet I'm trans. And like all of these people are just out there speaking for me, and it's kind of annoying. Like I used to not have to worry about going places in Tulsa. Even, dressed to the nines or whatever. And anymore, like there are places I don't go. And most of that is, I feel, because of the news media and the Democrats and their fucking abuse of me and this issue. And it's really sad. Like, My message this entire time has been that there are normal trans women that are not crazy fucking liberals. And when I say normal trans women, I mean like I am not a normal person. I know this. Roger that. But I am not a part of their fucking cult. Whatever the fuck that is that they got going on. I don't even understand really what that's about. I've just always been this way and basically decided to start telling you guys about it. And that started mainly because we were having these discussions every fucking night on Matt's show. And how do you continue to not tell people this when this is what we're talking about? I had been working on transitioning and coming out for several years at the point that I told the internet. And it saddens me that there are people that continue to think that this isn't real or whatever, that like whether it's me or anyone else, anyone who's doing this, it's real. Like I couldn't stand who I was and being that way. And I did a lot of work to get here. And it's one of those things that like I never got any respect for from people that I used to talk to all the time. And eventually, you can't take hanging out with someone that just thinks you're a piece of shit. I really hate those guys. I didn't hate them when I left. I hate them now. And most of the reason for that is because it's like they died or like they killed me, one or the other. I don't fucking know. I got tired of their bullshit, and I guess I said some shit that hurt their feelings. I don't even fucking know. Nor do I care anymore. I hope everyone is enjoying E-Honda uninterrupted now. I know I am. I'm very much enjoying not being interrupted by E-Honda. I don't think I'm ever going to see any of those guys ever again. like, and like that's the thing is, I don't give a fuck. I'll have new friends. Or I won't. Honestly, at this point, I don't really care to have friends. Like, I have my buddy that I want to get land with, and I'm chit chatting with Guns and Barbecue still. But pretty much the rest of that community is somewhat dead to me. There are some members of it that like had nothing to do with this or whatever, so maybe some of them are okay. I don't know. The thing that made me leave that little group was that I was getting death threats from Nazis and pictures of my family, and I was being told. I'm not going to say what I was being told. I don't think that was right, but I was being told something about someone. And I don't even want to speak that because I don't think it was true. It pisses me off a little bit that I'm never going to talk to any of them ever again. Honestly, at this point, it's done. So that's that. When I say it's done, I mean like I would not talk to them for $800 million an hour. I very much used to enjoy our show. That was E Honda and I arguing while Matt tried to fucking do the news. I thought it was fun. I think Matt thought it was fun. I can only imagine how boring that show is now. Like, if you still watch that show, or either one of those shows, if Honda even still has a channel, I'd love to know. Is it still entertaining? Do you miss me? You gotta miss me. Honestly, who else can get Honda to flip out the way I do? Or vice versa. I'll miss that. You know, me making him flip out, not the other way around. So, what about rapiers? You could get a rapier. Honestly, there's an argument to be made that if you know what you're doing with a rapier in a modern context, people would be fucked. It's most swords are somewhere between like 36 and 40 inches, something like that. Your average rapier is like 42 to 48 inches, and they're used one handed, and they're pretty svelte and well balanced, so you can use them with an outstretched arm easily as a thrusting weapon. Has a range of 6 or 7 feet, and you can stab someone in the throat with it. That's what that sword is made for. I don't know if I would pick that. It's a lot of sword to carry. It is cool. I think in a modern context, having something like a cavalry saber or a cutlass, you're a little shorter sword, a little bit easier to tote with you, a little bit lighter sword, a little bit less complex hilt. That's the thing with most rapiers; they have a big basket on them. It's difficult to carry that sword. It may be the best thing to stab a man with the throat with, but it's not the best one to use in a modern context. And like, I want a rapier. I like them. And half of the reason that I like the scimitar is it being saber-ish is a little bit of a less complicated rapier, shorter rapier, heavier bladed, more cutting rapier. Like there's a lot of differences, but I don't know. It's somewhere in that same family of swords for me, in that it is fairly well balanced and basically made to stab people in the throat with. It's made to do other things too, and like that's the thing that you're getting when you get a scimitar or a saber, is you're getting something that you can still stab someone in the throat with, and it cuts and chops and does all sorts of other things. It's a good all around sword. Like if you're not going to go with something that big, and we presented several options in this little, video on swords and whatnot that you could go with instead. So, new thought exercise. What is the one sword I haven't talked about yet that I would actually buy? Mm, um, Viking swords. I would definitely look at Viking swords because there's a lot of people that have a cultural thing with those swords, and they are a sword that you could easily use sword and shield in a modern context. It is not going to be as good as other swords. You are definitely taking a technological disadvantage. Okay, and this is the same thing with the medieval swords, in my opinion. Um, Shit like a cavalry saber or a scimitar or a rapier has decided advantages in weight and balance over the Viking sword. But the Viking sword has raw power. It's a steel baseball bat. So it's not like it's bad. It's just you need to know what are you trying to do with the sword? Are you trying to stab someone in the neck, or are you going to be engaging in shield on shield steel baseball bat combat or some shit? Or do you have some sort of secondary reason, ancestry, love of history, whatever, why you want a Viking sword? Could be. It's kind of the same thing with the pirate sword or, Japanese sword or any of those. Like, if you just have a particular love of something in history, I would definitely go with that sword. Especially if it's something that you can learn to use, that's even cooler. Like, if you are really into samurai, buy a fucking katana and learn how to use it. Okay? Like, if you're really into whatever, do the same thing. The Kazakh sword is an interesting one. That's big in Russia right now. I don't know if I would carry one of those around. It might make you look a certain way to the government. I don't know. What about Chinese swords, Asian swords in general that are not katanas? Um, I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of basically any of those swords. There's a couple that are kind of like a straight infantry officer's sword. Eh, okay, but like I don't know why you'd buy that over anything else. Um, there's a bunch of unusual like Chinese kung fu weapons that would be more interesting than Chinese swords, in my opinion. I know there are more models. I'm blanking right now on names. I think they have something called a Dao. I don't know. Chinese swords are not my thing. I am a European sword person for the most part, and half of the reason that I went with the scimitar is a love of cultures of the Middle East and even Asia. Like I really like one of the things that made me start liking this sword a lot was reading about Genghis Khan. The swords that Genghis Khan used were roughly like this. They might have been shittier in construction and might even have been slightly different, but they were the progenitors of this sword. I think this sword is the closest thing you can buy right now to what Genghis Khan would have carried. And as such, I think that's pretty dope. And it's made to be used on horseback. It's a Mongol sword. That's the thing I think a lot of people don't get is I don't know that this sword was used by the Mongols initially, but they picked it up at some point when they fucking went through Asia, if it wasn't their sword, and they spread it all over the place. The reason that these swords are used by Barbary Coast pirates and shit all the way out in fucking Africa, and the Mongols, and basically identical swords in India, and almost identical swords in Southeast Asia in parts, depending on where it is. Once you get into like the woods of Southeast Asia, swords start disappearing and like machete like things start popping up because there's no reason to have a long sword because you'll never get to use it. But anyway, Genghis Khan spread this sword all over the place. And in reality, even the Kazakh sword is very much this sword without a guard. From what I understand, it's a curved saber. Other historical things that might pique your interest. I'm trying to think. If you do like Rapiers, the Three Musketeers is obvious, but if you want to see Cavalry Sabers, go watch anything on the Civil War. There's a lot of Cavalry Saber shit in the Civil War. Also, anything on the Napoleonic War, you'll see a bunch of that. The Patriot. Yeah. These are the swords I would suggest you buy. Aside from those and the ones we've already mentioned, the general rule of thumb I would follow is I would want something to be made of steel. With a sword, I am willing to accept a latitude in the type of steel. The better steel you could get, the better. But like the sword that I have right here is 1055. It is really easy to sharpen, and it takes a razor sharp edge, and it holds it as well as any other sword I've ever had. Swords tend to get abused. They bump into things. They get dull spots. They need to be sharpened regularly. I wouldn't worry so much about what kind of steel it's made out of. I would worry more about the balance of the sword and what kind of sheath it has. Or scabbard, rather, sorry. These are the things that really start to matter in a sword rather than the kind of steel it's made out of. Almost any steel is acceptable. And the reason I say that is if you've ever used a steel sword versus a non-steel sword, you'll notice a considerable difference. If you use 1055 versus 5160, there can be a difference. I'm not saying there won't be, especially in edge retention if you do your job correctly on edge geometry and heat treatment. 5160 could do shit that would amaze you. However, it is harder to sharpen than the shit. And if you're going to have a big ass blade, that's something to consider. It's not a pocket knife. You can't just, sharpen that one spot all day. You need to be able to move some metal. That's why I would buy a softer sword. I would prize the ability to take a razor sharp edge more than the ability to hold it forever. And again, this might be, a difference in usage. Like if I was going to be on a battlefield banging into fucking metal all day, unable to resharpen my blade, yeah, I would definitely want a 5160 blade, and I'd want it done right. Okay, but for a flesh only blade that I'm going to use intermittently on one or two people here or there, I think 1055 is fine. If I were going to get a sword made of any particular steel, I would get it made of 5160. For all the reasons I just said, it is better and it can be sharpened. I just, the thing that I really like about this sword that I have now over the katana that I had a few years ago is I can just sharpen this thing. I can do it quickly and efficiently, and it comes out as sharp as it was from the factory. The katana got dings in the blade almost immediately too, and there was no way to sharpen that thing other than to send it to somebody who does that. You could ruin it, you know. And it's been my experience that like your sword is going to run into things, basically. Like I was babying that katana, and it still had some edge damage from some shit. I didn't even use the fucking thing. It's inevitable. Your sword will take damage on the edge. The edge is supposed to be a super fine little metal thing, like it's vulnerable. So either have a sword that's made to not be vulnerable, which most are not, and even those you'll fuck up eventually, and then it's much more difficult to sharpen them. Or you do what cold steel did with this thing, and you make it out of cheap, effective steel, and you make it an edge that is pretty easy to sharpen. It's kind of like a secondary bevel on a fucking knife. And I'm not saying I like that on most things, but on this sword, I think it makes sense. This thing still cuts like crazy, and it makes it much easier to take care of the sword. That's all I got on swords and other shit. Oh, hope you guys have enjoyed this. I didn't know what to talk about today, so this was the show you got. I'm trying to do a couple videos a day and make one of them something like this where it's at least an hour. I have to go get ready for lunch now because I'm going to go get some Mexican food with my grandma and my aunt. So, girls' day out. I'll see you guys later.